It is 1 p.m., so I just wanted to once again welcome everyone to Drisha. It's so good to have you with us. This is the first class in the series on Shemitah in the Mishnah, challenges and opportunities. We encourage you to turn on your video if you are able to. We understand if you can, but it is really nice to be able to see faces when you teach. Also, as always, feel free to ask questions or make comments. You can write them down in the chat box here on Zoom, or you can unmute and ask questions. If you're watching us live on Facebook, of course, you can comment there as well or ask questions. This class will undertake the close study of Mishnayot Sheviit BeIyyun, working through Masechta with a focus on literary and conceptual issues. Today's class will aim to cover chapters 1 through 3, resting the Lent timeline and operations. It's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Avraham Walfish, goes by Avie. He's a retired teacher of Talmudic literature and rabbinic thought, and was recently appointed as head of Halachic Beit Midrash of Beit Hillel Rabbinical Organization. At Yeshiva University, he completed his BA in philosophy while studying Talmud with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. After making Aliyah, he received his rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg and completed his MA and PhD at Hebrew University, writing his dissertation on literary features of Mishnah. He has also taught and lectured in many frameworks in Israel and abroad, including Herzog College, Michlala, Pardes Institute, Bar Ilan University, and Drisha. His extensive publications in different areas of Jewish studies include the BeIyyun Mishnah website and a commentary on Mishnah Berachot, Mishnayot tapestries. And in 2005, he was awarded the prize of the Israeli Minister of Education for creative work in Jewish culture. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Walfish.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. My association with Drisha goes back a long way. I'm Rabbi David Silber's brother-in-law, so I have accompanied Drisha for many, many years, and it's always a pleasure to teach with Drisha. This is going to be a very challenging class because Masechet Sheviit comprises 10 chapters. 10 chapters of Mishnah, and not the most popular or best known chapters of Mishnah. So to somehow get a sense of what's going on in these chapters is a tall order. We're going to be looking at it more from a panoramic viewpoint, looking at overall patterns and structures, and occasionally, since we can't deal with overall structures without dealing with details, we'll dive in occasionally, sort of swoop down like a seagull to fish out and flesh out some of the details, so that we'll have a chance to see how these larger patterns are being accomplished. As a result of this method, I think there's going to be an extremely Jewish class, by which I mean Jews traditionally have focused at least as much on questions as on answers. And besides the fact that we're going to wind up with more questions than we will have an opportunity to answer, but I think one of the main things that we'll be able to uncover in our study of Masechet Sheviit is the kinds of questions that Chazal asked. What are the kinds of issues that concern them? And so, without further ado, let's dive in, and we're going to start with some background. Okay, in order to understand what Mishnah is doing, it's important to understand what Mishnah is plugging into, what it's responding to. So, of course, we start with the biblical background. Shemitah appears in the Torah in two different places, and by looking at how the Torah presents Shemitah in these two places, we'll first of all get some idea of what Shemitah is about in the Torah, and we'll also have an opportunity to see the kinds of questions that that are going to confront Chazal when they put together Tractate Sheviit. Okay, so let's look first of all at Shemot Perek Kaf Gimel. The psukim that interest us are the two highlighted psukim in blue, but we'll see them in context. Okay, so the immediately preceding pasuk, the ger lo tilchatz v'atem yida'atem et nefesh hager ki gerim heitem beretz Mitzrayim, not to oppress the stranger or alien resident. Then we have the psukim of Shemitah, and afterwards we have Shabbat, pasuk Yud Bet. Sheshet yamim ta'aseh ma'asecha v'yom hashvi'i tishbot l'man yanuach shorcha v'chamorecha yinafesh ben amatcha v'hager. Okay, so we have the laws of Shabbat. It's interesting to see how the Torah presents the laws of Shabbat in this one pasuk. What is Shabbat designed for? In order that your domestic animals, shorcha v'chamorecha, as well as your servants, ben amatcha, as well as the ger, the same ger that we had back in pasuk tet, okay, the non-Jewish residents of the land, okay, in order that they may be able to rest. So Shabbat is presented here with a strong emphasis on equality. First of all, social equality. Okay, so Shabbat equalizes the citizen, the master, with all other members of society. On Shabbat, they're all equal. Okay, and even with the animal kingdom. Okay, the animals are also supposed to rest. That's how Shabbat is presented. Okay, so now we can already imagine that Shemitah is going to be presented in a way that will correspond to this emphasis on equality, okay, on social equalizing, okay, and that there will be a connection between Shemitah and Shabbat. Of course, there's an obvious connection with the number 7, but we'll develop this more a little later. V'sheish shanim. Now we'll look at the psukim of Shemitah. V'sheish shanim tizra et artzecha v'asafta et tevuata. Okay, 6 years you shall sow the land and gather its produce. V'shvi'i tishmetena unetashta. The 7th year you shall abandon it. That's what the word Shemitah literally means. Okay, to let go of something, to abandon it. Shall abandon it. Okay, v'achlu avyonei amecha, and the poor of your nation shall eat it. V'yitram, and what's left over, tochal chayat hasadeh. Okay, what is left over shall be eaten by the beasts of the field. Kein ta'aseh lecharmecha lezeitecha. So this is not only for fields, this is also for vineyards, okay, and for olive orchards, okay, and these are the 3 staples of the biblical diet, okay, daganti rosh v'yitzhar, okay, okay, so all of these are going to have the same fate. Now, it's interesting to note that the Torah doesn't explicitly say that you're not supposed to work the land during the Shemitah. It says for 6 years you will sow the land and you will gather the produce. The 7th year, what you're supposed to do is abandon the produce. Now, can I sow the land? It doesn't exactly say whether I can sow the land. We can imagine if you're not able to gather the produce, so presumably you're also not sowing the land. But the emphasis seems to be on the produce rather than on the land. And the reason the produce is so central is because it's supposed to be left for the poor and for the beasts of the field. Because again, we're talking about something that is a great social leveler. Okay, not only among human beings, but even with animals, and in this case, even the beasts of the field. On Shabbat, the animals that rest are the animals that are domestic, okay, that are under human control. Here,
Does that include the slaves? Does that include the slaves that work for you?
would the slave, you're talking about Shemitah. Presumably,
Right.
yes. Yeah,
Right.
presumably, yes.
Equality.
That's right. In other words, if you're abandoning it and you're letting the poor wander into your field and consume the produce, and if you're even letting the beasts of the field, the beasts of the wild, so then this case means the wild, letting the wild beasts roam through your field, so it stands to reason that any member of your household, including the slaves, would be allowed to do that as well. Okay, so that's how Shemitah is presented here. Okay, it's very sketchy in terms of the do's and the don'ts. Okay, but the one main do is that the produce is open basically to everybody. Okay, now let's look at towards the end of Vayikra Perek Kaf Hey. We have a somewhat more elaborate presentation of Shemitah. It's subtly more elaborate. Okay, the emphases are somewhat different. By Daber Hashem el Moshe Ba'ar Sinai Lemor. This, of course, is the famous question from the Midrash cited by Rashi. Ma'inyan Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai. Why is Har Sinai mentioned at this juncture of the Torah? But that's not our concern for now. Daber el Bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem. Ki tavohu el haaretz asher ani noten lachem. When you come to the land that I am giving you. So we already have a new idea here, and that is that this mitzvah has to do with the land that God is giving us. We didn't have that emphasis back in Shemot. V'shavta haaretz Shabbat Lashem, a very striking anthropomorphic expression. The land shall rest a Shabbat Lashem. Shabbat Lashem is a term that elsewhere appears in relation to Shabbat. Okay, and here we have another Shabbat. So here the connection between Shemitah and Shabbat is really underscored. Okay, but who is supposed to rest? The land. That's interesting. It doesn't say the farmer is supposed to rest, and as we'll see, farmer actually can be quite busy. Okay, there's just to take a simple example, if the farmer wants to take off the Shemitah year and moonlight as a tailor, a taxi driver, truck driver, computer programmer, or heaven only knows what, no problem. You can do whatever. You can work your tail off during the Shemitah year. Okay, the one who is supposed to rest during the Shemitah year is the land. Now, what does it mean for the land to rest? That we'll have to see in the ensuing psukim. Sheish shanim tizra sadecha v'sheish shanim tizmor karmecha v'yasafta et tevuata. Okay, now this sounds very reminiscent of the first pasuk in Shemot. It just adds the kerem to the sadeh, but it's basically the same idea. But now the second pasuk is much more elaborate. Uvashana hashvi'it Shabbat Shabbaton yela aret Shabbat Lashem Sadcha lo tizra v'charmecha lo tizmor. It shall be not just a Shabbat, but a Shabbat of Shabbat, Shabbat of Shabbat, Shabbat Shabbaton yela aret, a Shabbat Lashem. Okay, you shall not sow your field, and you shall not prune your vineyards, because pruning the vines stimulates growth. That's the equivalent in a vineyard of planting. Okay, the wild growing plants, you shall not kotzer. Now, kotzer literally means harvest. Okay, now what does it actually mean? You can't harvest it. We're going to see in ensuing psukim, as we saw in Shemot, that you can enjoy the produce of the land. So what does it mean not to harvest? Like Chazal understand this, and I think it's the only reasonable explanation, is normally when you harvest, you don't just gather in a small amount. Okay, harvesting is done en masse. Okay, you harvest the entire crop. You take a large field, you harvest the entire crop, and then you gather it together. Usually you store it in a storehouse of some sort after it's undergone some sort of processing. Okay, that's what you can't do during the Shemitah year. Okay, and similarly at Din Venezirecha, the grapes of the vineyard, you also cannot gather in the regular manner. Shnat Shabbaton Yelet, and this is what it means to be a Shnat Shabbaton. So here there are two aspects to what it means to be a Shnat Shabbaton. A Shnat Shabbaton for the land means, first of all, not to sow the land to stimulate growth, and secondly, not to gather the produce in the normal fashion. Okay, and this basically allows the land to rest, a rest on behalf of God, a rest for God. Okay, we'll talk a bit about what that means in a little while. Vaita Shabbat haaretz lachem liochla. The Shabbat of the land shall be for you for consumption. Lecha ulavdecha v'la'amatecha v'lischircha u'tovshavcha agarim imach. All of the weaker segments of the population, okay, are equal with you in being able to benefit. Okay, for your domestic animals and the wild beasts in your land. Okay, so all of the produce shall be for consumption. Okay, this last phrase, okay, we'll take a little look at this point at one of the ideas that Chazal understood in this pasuk. They understood that human beings are allowed to benefit from the produce in the field only as long as it is available to the wild beasts. When the wild beasts are able to roam around your field and take produce, then human beings can benefit. In other words, you can't, if you have stored up some of the Shemitah produce, not supposed to harvest it en masse, but I've gathered a little bit here, a little bit there, okay, and I gathered enough so I can put it away in my cupboard and save it for several weeks, okay. I'm allowed to benefit from that as long as the beasts can roam around in the field and benefit. But if they can't find it there, then I have to remove it from my cupboard as well. Now, what exactly that means, we'll discuss when we get to the later portion of Masechet Sheviit. Okay, but that's already one of the points that Chazal pick up on. Okay, the next psukim talk about how this is a very difficult mitzvah to perform. Okay, and in pasuk Kaf, for example, it's going to be a bad year because the land is going to produce much less. What are we going to be able to consume during that year? So if you observe Shemitah, then you will enjoy a divine blessing during the 6th year. And during the 6th year, it will produce enough produce for 3 years. For the 6th year itself, for the 7th year. But since you haven't gathered normally during the 7th year, you're also going to need, normally, the produce of 1 year lasts into the following year. Okay, and so the 7th year produce will have to last into the 8th year as well. So the 6th year will have to produce enough to support you for 3 years. Okay, and now I skipped a pasuk to something that's actually related to Yovel. The Yovel is mentioned in this connection, the Jubilee year. Okay, but there's a very important pasuk that reflects on Shemitah as well that we should bring. The land cannot be sold in perpetuity. Okay, in other words, that's part of the Ovel idea. When you sell land, then it returns to you during the Jubilee year. Ki li haaretz, because the land belongs to me, says God. Ki gerim betoshavim atem imadi. You are not really the owners of the land. Okay, you are sojourners. Gerim betoshavim. You are sojourners on my land. Okay, in other words, God, okay, even though for 6 out of 7 years, God allows us to treat the land as though it were ours, and for 49 out of 50 years, he allows us to sell the land as though it truly belonged to us. But every 7th year and every 50th year, God reminds us that we are not really the owners of the land. And this, of course, suggests very strongly that we're talking about the land of Israel, and that was Pasuk Bet, Ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem. This very special land, the land of Israel, is a land that belongs to God, and even when he gives us control over it, he is, in a sense, appointing us custodians over the land more than he is granting us actual ownership of the land. And Shemitah is an expression of that. So to let the land rest every 7th year is a way basically of acknowledging that the land doesn't truly belong to us. It sort of belongs to us, but every 7th year we remind ourselves that that there's a deep truth, that the land of Israel really does not fully belong to us because it continues to belong to God. Okay, and I think that also explains this notion of Shabbat Lashem, of the land resting and of Shabbat Lashem. So even though we have the idea of social leveling that's repeated in Vayikra, but the focus is very different. Okay, if the focus in Vayikra was social, was Ben Adam LaChavero, in Shmot rather, was social, Ben Adam LaChavero, the focus in Vayikra is on Ben Adam LaMakom. And the social aspect of it is a kind of outgrowth of the fact that we are not really the owners. And therefore, if we're not really the owners, so then every 7th year we can't exercise control. God says, look, as long as you're exercising control and preventing others from enjoying it, you're acting like an owner. Every 7th year, stop being the owner. It reverts back to being my owner. There are commentators who have noted quite accurately that there are overtones here or undertones here of Gan Eden, okay, of the Shemitah year treating Eretz Yisrael like Gan Eden. Gan Eden, okay, man didn't own Gan Eden, okay, and man's intercourse with animals and with other human beings was not one of control or ownership. And Eretz Yisrael during the Shemitah year becomes a kind of throwback to Gan Eden, because Eretz Yisrael is, in a certain sense, a way of translating Gan Eden into reality. There's already a way of saying that Shemitah is a rather utopian idea. When we get to the Mishnah, we'll see that the Mishnah is keenly aware of the fact that Shemitah, more than perhaps any other area of halakha, is an area where there's a huge gap between what the halakha seems to demand and what people are actually able to carry out in practice. Okay, and a good part of Masechta Sheviit will be devoted to that. Okay, now some of the other issues that are going to concern that we could imagine would concern Chazal would be when we say the land is resting, it's presented in a very minimalistic fashion. Okay, don't plant or foster growth. Also, don't harvest in the normal fashion. What about other kinds of work? Okay, if you ask a farmer, his main work is not the planting. Okay, that's a very small portion of his work. Okay, what he has to do a lot of things before you get to the planting, right? You have to prepare the ground for the planting. You have to plow the land. Okay, then after the planting, you have to water, you have to fertilize. Okay, you have to do all kinds of activities of maintenance of the plant. You have to protect it from pests. You have to Okay, if it gets injured, you have to repair it. What about all those kinds of work? Torah doesn't say a word about them. Okay, the Torah mentions only don't plant or prune vines, don't harvest in the normal way. Okay, what else is involved in this Shabbat Haaretz? Not clear. And one of the main functions of Mishnah is to take these kinds of ideas that are presented in a somewhat vague fashion in the Torah and to flesh them out. Okay, to translate them into language of practice, to translate them into language of halakha. Okay, the Torah is not talking the language of halakha. The Torah is sketching, okay, like an overall plan. Okay, and the Mishnah will have to take that overall plan and flesh it out and say, you can do this, you can't do that. Okay, so that's one of the things we can expect Mishnah to do. Now, having said that, okay, let's just do a little exercise before we dive into the Mishnah itself and ask ourselves, okay, let's imagine, okay, each one of us sitting here, each one of us is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, okay, who wants to compose a Mishnah. Now, of course, he's not composing the Mishnah, he's compiling the Mishnah from other sources. Okay, we'll just use him as a, convenient figure on which to hang the question. Okay, what do you imagine would be the kinds of topics which you would want to discuss at the beginning of Masechta Sheviit? I'm devoting a Masechet to this law that appears in two places in the Torah. Okay, so how would I want to start it? How would I want to open the discussion so that the person who is learning my book, okay, will understand what this topic is, what it's about, what its details are, and so on. Okay, thoughts?
When does it start? When does the year start? Mm-hmm.
Okay, when does Shemitah start? Okay, that actually is discussed elsewhere in the Mishnah. Okay, Masechta Rosh Hashanah mentions that at the beginning. One of the four Rosh Hashanah listed at the beginning of Masechta Rosh Hashanah is the day we call Rosh Hashanah, which is Aleph B'Tishrei, and the Mishnah there identifies Aleph B'Tishrei as the beginning of Shemitah. But you're absolutely right; that would be very logical to put into the beginning of our Masechet. What else? Chana, yes.
It's a positive mitzvah in the Torah.
Okay, yes, there certainly is a positive mitzvah in the Torah. Okay, Tishmitena unitashta are two positive mitzvahs. Shavtar and Shabbat Hashem is arguably a positive mitzvah. So you might want to identify which mitzvot are there, positive as well as negative. Yes, Anna.
I'm wondering, I don't know if this is what you're going for. I'm wondering how it applies to the poor who don't own fields, who basically, it would seem to me that this whole structure would work to their detriment because, like how, I mean, it can apply only to landowners, presumably.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So you're right that the part of Shemitah that addresses not working the land, that applies to the landowners. Okay, although it would presumably apply to people who might want to be his day laborers who actually carry out the heavy labor. Okay, but it would apply primarily, if not exclusively, to the owners. But in terms of benefiting from the produce, so here you could say the poor presumably do benefit. Okay, because even if the land is producing less, but the poor are getting a much higher percentage of whatever the earth is producing than what they do in a normal year. Okay, so if they're losing out because the land is producing less than it normally does, that's probably balanced out and maybe even superseded by the fact that they have free run of the land and they can take whatever they like. Okay, yes.
Yeah, how does it apply? Because we're not, the whole thing is that we're not allowed to utilize what the land does produce, okay? So I'm talking about how did the Jewish poor fit into this? They are allowed to eat from the Shemitah year,
Absolutely, yes.
but others are not.
Apparently, everyone is allowed. The
Ah,
ger is allowed. The sachir, the toshav, the ger, and the evyonei amecha we had in Shmot. Okay, everybody seems to have free run of the land. Okay, so it seems that everyone can benefit from it, including the animals and the domestic and wild animals. Okay, someone is making noise. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we would want to. Okay, we would want to talk about when it begins. Okay. What other thing? The mitzvot that are involved in it. What else might we expect to talk about?
Well, it says ki tavo el haaretz, but does that mean that if we don't live in Eretz Yisrael, do we still have to observe this, like Shabbat?
Right. So where does Shemitah apply? That would be definitely a topic. So the where, the when, the mitzvot, that's part of the what. Okay. But I would add one thing to the mitzvot. You know what? Let's take a look at someone who did our work for us. Okay. Instead of our guessing what we would expect the Mishnah to do, let's look at someone who almost invariably does what we would expect the Mishnah to do, but more often than not, the Mishnah doesn't do it, but he does, and that's the Rambam. Okay. Now, the Rambam, when he codified his Mishneh Torah, now you'll notice the word Mishneh Torah, the name itself is very reminiscent of Mishnah, and that's not by accident. Okay. The Rambam makes it very clear in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah that the Mishneh Torah was modeled on Mishnah. Okay? Now, it's modeled on Mishnah in many respects. The language is Mishnaic language, and, the style is, generally speaking, Mishnaic style. What is very un-Mishnaic, though, is the system of arrangement. The Rambam arranges his Mishneh Torah very differently than the Mishnah. Okay? And the Rambam arranges it usually pretty much the way we would expect it to be arranged. Okay? And that's not by accident. We're all products of Western society. I'm guessing that all of us have academic training. Okay? So the academic training is, all offshoots of the classical philosophy, okay, which by means of which the Rambam was educated, right? So the Rambam learned from Aristotle how to classify, and that's more or less where we learned it also, through many of the disciples of disciples of disciples of Aristotle. So let's take a look at how Rambam arranges it. Rambam says, Mitzvah taseh lishbot me'avodat ha'aretz v'avodat ha'ilan b'shana Sheviit Shabbat Lashem. So Rambam starts off with the mitzvah. Okay, the mitzvah taseh. Okay, shenemar becharish v'katzir tishmot. B'chol osem lacham evodat haaretz oilenot b'shana zo bitel mitzvah taseh. And if you do work during that year, you have violated the mitzvah taseh. Ba'avar lo taseh, and you have also violated a lo taseh. Shenemar sadcha lo tizra v'char lo tizmor. So he mentions the mitzvot lo taseh. Okay. Then the Rambam continues and he details what's included. What about all the other kinds of work that the Torah doesn't mention? So the Rambam calls those toladot. Okay, that's like on Shabbat, you have avot and toladot. Again, Shabbat is a good model for Shemitah. Okay, so the other kinds of work are toladot. Okay, any other kind of prohibited work during Shemitah will be an offshoot, something I conclude. Things that the Torah says I can't do on Shemitah, well, there are other things that are somehow like it. They also prepare the ground for growing or foster growth or are involved in how I how I take the produce, gather in the produce from the field. So those would all be toladot. Okay? So the Rambam says, for all of those toladot, in other words, there are toladot, that's crucially important. The Rambam, of course, will list them. I'm just giving you a very brief sketch of what the Rambam presents. All of those, shalon yitparshu binyan zeh ein olo ke'alehen. All of the toladot, there are no malkot for that. Okay? In other words, you are fully violating the Torah prohibition only when you violate the things spelled out in the language of the Torah. When you violate other kinds of work, so then that's not a full-fledged violation. We can already wonder, does that mean perhaps that there are leniencies? Besides not getting the punishment that you get when you violate a Torah prohibition, perhaps there are other leniencies as well for toladot that you don't have for avot. The Rambam then begins to spell it out. Ketzad. So he gives you some examples. Hachofer, if you dig a ditch, or hachoresh, you plow, the tzorach hakarka, or hamisakel, you remove stones from the land, or hamizabel, you fertilize, v'chayotze ben mishar vodot haaretz, and similarly, and the Rambam goes on. Okay, that sounds very much like the kind of thing we would expect, right? Let's now just briefly mention that there is a tractate. Now you're already guessing that the tractate is not going to be Masechet Sheviit. Okay, that's what I'm building up to. I assume some of you guessed that already. Masechet Sheviit does not do what the Rambam did. Does something very different, and we'll see what it is in a bit. But there is another Masechet that's not Masechet Sheviit. Masechet Moed Katan. Masechet Moed Katan is about Chol HaMoed. Moed means Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed, the Mishnah compares to Shemitah. We'll talk about why in a minute. Okay, and the very first Mishnah in Masechet Moed Katan opens as follows. Mashkin Beit HaShlachin BaMoed Uva Shvi'it. Okay, Beit HaShlachin is an irrigated field. Okay, Chazal had fields that were irrigated directly by rainwater and fields that needed acts of irrigation. So an irrigated field can be watered during Chol HaMoed and also during Shemitah. Okay, and then there are details the Mishnah spells out and says, unless it's the sort of irrigation that would require a lot of work, because you can do this work on Chol HaMoed but not work very hard. It's called in Halakha Tircha Yitera. Can't do Tircha Yitera on Chol HaMoed. But if it's not that demanding a job, you're allowed to do that during Chol HaMoed and during Shemitah. Now let's think for a moment about why the Mishnah wants to compare Chol HaMoed with Shemitah. What Chol HaMoed and Shemitah have in common, okay, and this sets both of them apart from Shabbat or Yom Tov, is Shabbat and Yom Tov are days when work is prohibited, and all of them are short periods of time. A day at a time, work is prohibited. So I can take a day every week, or Yom Tov, comes up a few times during the year, and say, during these days, you can't water your fields, can't water your plants. Okay, that makes sense. But if I'm going to say, don't water your plants on Chol HaMoed, that's a whole week. Okay, some of those plants are not going to survive, or even if they survive, they'll be seriously damaged. Okay, and so the halacha does not forbid labor with the same severity on Chol HaMoed as it does on Shabbat or Yom Tov, and all the more so during a Shemitah year. Okay, Shemitah is a whole year. I'm not going to water any of my plants all of the Shemitah year. Some of them are certainly not going to survive, and some of them will be very severely damaged. And therefore, both of them, the prohibition of work is not as thoroughgoing, which already seems to indicate that the prohibition of work is playing a different role, both on Chol Hamoed and for Shemitah, than it is for Shabbat or Yom Tov. That's the opening of Masechet Moed Katan. And Masechet Moed Katan is talking about one of these toladot that the Rambam mentioned, irrigation, watering. Another interesting question. The Torah never said, can I water my plants during Shemitah? So here the Mishnah gives us an answer. Yes, certain kinds of watering can be done during Shemitah. The Talmud elaborates a bit on the Mishnah's rule and says irrigation and watering can be done during Shemitah when it's in order to preserve the plant, not when it's in order to foster further growth. Okay, but as long as it's what's called le'uk me'ilah, not to preserve the tree or to preserve the plant, that's okay. But interestingly, that's basically where the Mishnah directly addresses the question of what the Rambam put right away at the beginning of his discussion, which is what kinds of work can I do during Shemitah, what kinds of work can I not do during Shemitah? Because that's part of the basic essential definition of Shemitah. Okay, you have that in the Rambam. You have a little taste of that at the beginning of Masechet Moed Katan, and again, you've already guessed, you do not have that at the beginning of Masechet Sheviit. Okay, so let's take a brief look at what goes on. We'll look first at the first two chapters of Masechet Sheviit. Okay, by the end of the class, we will get at least a very brief look at the third chapter. Okay, because I promised to deal with the first three chapters. But let's take a brief overview of the first two chapters that really are a unit. Okay, and Masechet Sheviit opens with Ad Eimatai. Now that sounds like something, I think it was Ruth who suggested that we would want to open with, when does Shemitah begin? Okay, well, we don't exactly start with that, but we do start with when. When is good, but the when is going to surprise us. Ad Eimatai chorshin b'stei ha'ilan erev Sheviit. Until when can you plow the land during the sixth year? Sixth year. What's the problem with plowing land during the sixth year? Okay, so the Mishnah is already throwing us a curveball. It's talking about when, but it's already, first of all, the Mishnah, as it so often does, is presupposing a whole area of halakha that didn't appear in the Torah and was not spelled out anywhere prior to the Mishnah. Okay, nowhere did the Mishnah, we'll see the basis for it later on in this chapter. Okay, but again, the Mishnah, instead of starting at the beginning, the Mishnah likes to throw us in medias res. Okay, the Mishnah likes to throw us into the middle of a discussion. Okay, so instead of telling us, oh, guess what? There are kinds of work you cannot do already during the sixth year. I don't know why not yet, but instead of telling us that, the Mishnah says, well, until when can you do this particular kind of work during the sixth year? That's how we open. Okay, and we have a machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about that. Now, that's the topic that basically takes up the whole first chapter and continues into the second chapter. Okay, so let's just look. I brought some of the text of the Mishnah just so that those of you who are conversant enough in Hebrew can relate my headers to some of the content, but we don't. We're getting a panoramic view. We can't really look very much at the details. So the next two Mishnayot Bet and Gimel Ezahu Sdei Ha'ilan. How do I define a Sdei Ilan? Well, what do I? We said you can plow in a Sdei Ilan until such and such a day. Well, what is a Sdei Ilan? How do I define it? And in Gimel Echad Ilan Srak ve'Echad Ilan Ma'achal. Is there a difference between fruit-bearing trees and non-fruit-bearing trees? Mishnah Daled is the proof text for the preceding halachot. We will look at that in a little more detail in a few minutes. And then the next Mishnah gives us a footnote. What happens if the three trees that you need to define it as a field belong to three different owners? That's an interesting question. Can a field be partly owned by one, partly owned by another. We're already beginning to get a sense of something else that the Mishnah will be very concerned with, which is Shemitah a mitzvah on the individual or on the society? How do people interact with one another during the Shemitah? How do they cooperate with one another in observing Shemitah? That's like the subtext of this Mishnah. And then the Mishnah has an exception to this rule. We talked about trees, now they talk about saplings. Eser nitiot mefuzarot betoch beit sa'ah. Nitiot are saplings. If they're very young trees, so then chorshin kol beit sa'ah bishvilan ad Rosh Hashanah. Oh, guess what? We finally got our answer to when Shemitah begins. Okay? Again, so characteristic of the Mishnah. Instead of the Mishnah doing here what it did in Masechta Rosh Hashanah and telling us Shemitah year begins on Aleph B'Tishrei, here the Mishnah signals us, oh, guess what? Rosh Hashanah, which is Aleph B'Tishrei, that's when the 6th year ends and the 7th year begins. Bingo, now I know when Shemitah begins. But the halacha that concerns the Mishnah here is something else. Okay, the halacha that concerns the Mishnah here is that saplings, you can plow the earth all the way up till Rosh Hashanah, unlike the fruit, the trees. Okay, the tree field you could only plow until sometime around Shavuot. Okay, machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, kozman sheyafel pri, as opposed to ad ha'atzeret. Okay, but the Mishnah comments ukrovin divrei elu liot divrei elu. The two of them are saying almost the same thing. Okay, so basically this whole chapter has revolved around the question of what kind of plowing can I do, until when can I plow during the 6th year, leading up to the 7th year. So that depends if it's a tree field, if it's a sapling field, and so on. Okay, and then the chapter concludes, ad matai nikru netiot, until when are they called netiot? Now I want you to notice something very interesting about how this chapter is structured. Notice the opening of the chapter is ad matai, and the closing of the chapter is ad matai, but with two different meanings. Ad matai, can I do the work? At the beginning of the chapter, ad matai at the end of the chapter. Ad matai, until when are they considered to be saplings? But this phrase, ad matai, basically frames the chapter. Okay, and that's very characteristic of the Mishnah. And even when the Mishnah seems to be jumping around from one topic to another, you'll very often find that you have these parallels between the beginning and the end. Okay, it's called by scholars inclusio or envelope structure, different terms that are used for this closure where the end echoes the beginning. Okay, and you have that, and in this case, it's also an interesting word play because Arimata is performing two functions. So the whole first chapter has been not about what Shemitah is, not even about when Shemitah starts, but about how I lead into Shemitah, how I build up to Shemitah. That's the first chapter, and that carries on into chapter 2. And guess what? What opens chapter 2? Ad matai, same thing. Okay, Ad matai opens chapter 1. Ad matai opens chapter 2, and Ad matai chorshin bisdei halavan erev shvi'it. Until when can I plow in a white field? A white field means a field of grain. Okay, a non-tree field. Okay, erev shvi'it, and here, okay, it's ad shetichla halecha, until the moisture in the ground is no longer there, until it's dried out. Okay, and Rabbi Shimon objects. Natata tarat kol echad bechad biyado. So you have basically allowed every individual to decide for himself until when he can do it. So I want to have a universal date. that everyone can know, everyone can identify. I don't want everyone to decide until when he can do it. So, Ella, according to Rabbi Shimon, Vistei alavan ara Pesach, uvistei hailan ara tzeret. Guess another echo of the first chapter, right? So it's clear these two chapters are designed to be read in light of one another. They're dealing with the same topic, but in two different frameworks. One of them, the framework of trees, the other one in the framework of grain fields. Okay, but then chapter 2 takes an interesting sideline. Okay, it talks about other kinds of maintenance that can be done until Rosh Hashanah. Mizablin, fertilizing, ma'adrin, hoeing, misaklin, mikarsamin, mizardin. Okay, these are all different kinds of acts of maintenance, and most of them are designed for preserving. Okay, they're protecting the tree. Most of these are for trees. They're protecting the tree from damage. So interestingly, we opened with a grain field, but we've gone back to trees. Okay, but going back to trees, we're now expanding our discussion of what kinds of things can be done, okay, during the 6th year, leading up to and into the 7th year. Then we have a section, to what year do crops belong? Now this is, again, a continuation of the 6th year, because the question is, we open with Mishnah Vav, Ein notin, vein mabrichin, vein markivin, erev shviit, pachot mishloshim yom lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Okay, if I'm within 30 days of Rosh Hashanah, of the Shemitah year, so then it's already a problem for me to plant new crops. Why? Because then it's too close for comfort. The crops are basically growing during the Shemitah year. Even though I did the actual act of planting before the Shemitah year, but the main growth is going to be, in other words, the plants are going to take and are going to start really sprouting and growing during the Shemitah year. So again, I'm extending Shemitah backwards into a period before that, but this time not in acts of preparing the land and not in acts of maintenance, but now in acts of planting per se. Okay, and from there, there's a discussion of different kinds of plants. What year do they belong to? And this, the Mishnah notes, is relevant not only, okay, if you look at Mishnah Zayin, mit asrin l'she'avaru mutarin b'shvi'it. So this is relevant to the laws of Maser as well. So this is integrating Shemitah with other agricultural laws and other Masechtot in Seder Zra'im. Okay, so when I determine what year the produce belongs to as far as Shemitah is concerned, I'm also determining what year it belongs to as far as Ma'asrot are concerned. Okay, and the final Mishnah regarding that talks about Hadluin Shikiman Lezera im Ikshu Lifnei Rosh Hashanah v'nifsalu me'ochal adam mutar l'kaiman b'shvi. So now we're talking about a very special case, talking about Dluin, usually translated as gourds or squash, that you are holding on to, not to eat them, but for their seeds, because you want to take the seeds and replant them. Im ikshu, if the seeds grew hard before Rosh Hashanah and they can't be eaten, and if then you can preserve them into the Shemitah year, but if not, then you can't preserve them into the Shemitah year. Now, the reason I dwell on this a bit is because Dluin appeared again in the first Mishnah. Miksha'ot umidla'ot. How do I know whether the earth is still moist? Because I see if farmers are still plowing the land to plant gourds, okay, and other similar kinds of produce, that's my sign that the land is still moist. So the Dluim make a recurrence. Now the Miksha'ot comes the word kishuim, which is another kind of a plant. Some think it means cucumbers or some other form of squash or something belonging to that family. Now here we have the word hikshu. Hikshu is not the name of a plant. It means to become hard, but it's the same root as kishuim. So again, we have the end of the chapter echoing the beginning. And the term afar lavan appears in this Mishnah, echoing this day lavan from the beginning. Okay, so what we've gotten a sense of already is that even though the Mishnah is doing some jumping around, especially in chapter 2, we're jumping from topic to topic, okay, but clearly the Mishnah thinks there's an overarching structure, okay, because the end of the chapter echoes the beginning of the chapter. Secondly, we see the two chapters are functioning together. In fact, in the Talmud, these two chapters are identified as Shnei HaPrakim, the two chapters. And they deal with the topic that in the Talmud is called Tosefet Sheviit. And that's the opening topic of Masechet Sheviit. The opening topic is Tosefet Sheviit. Now, on one level, you can say that that's logical because what the Mishnah sometimes does, particularly when you're dealing with time-bound mitzvot, is to present a mitzvah chronologically. So instead of first of all explaining what Shemitah is, the Mishnah first of all explains, okay, the timetable. And the timetable doesn't start at Shemitah. It starts in the build-up towards Shemitah during the 6th year. Okay, so on that level, I think, I think what the Mishnah does make sense. But I'd like to make one further point, and since we're getting towards the end of our hour, so we'll make this our closing point, or actually one of two closing points. We'll make a second closing point briefly afterwards. Okay, to understand why Tosefet Sheviit is such a crucial notion for the framers of the Mishnah. Okay, now the place where the Mishnah explains what Tosefet Sheviit is all about is Mishnah Dalet. Remember, that's what I labeled, in the first frame here, the proof text. Okay, so here we have the language, Shenemar becharishu v'katzir tishbot. That pasuk is mentioned here in Parshat Ki Tisa. Look at the opening of the pasuk. Sheshet yamim ta'avod, uvayom hashvi'i tishbot, becharishu v'katzir tishbot. Okay, now, becharishu v'katzir tishbot seems clearly to be talking about Shabbat, not about Shemitah. Shemitah, is alluded to elsewhere, okay, but not in this chapter at all. Okay, but let's look at what the Mishnah does with this pasuk. Shenemar becharish v'katzir tishbot. Ein sarich lomar charish v'katzir shel shvi'it. Okay, charish and katzir of shvi'it, I know I can't do. That's forbidden labor during the Shemitah year. But we're already assuming we're talking about Shemitah. Why are we assuming we're talking about Shemitah? Presumably because it seems redundant. We already said, Bayom HaShvi'it Tishbot. Now, why emphasize Becharishu v'katzir Tishbot? Okay, obviously, we have to shovek all the time. Charish and Katzir are two agricultural seasons. Okay, obviously, I have to rest on Shabbat at any season, including Charish and Katzir. So, this is a drasha of Rabbi Akiva. We know that from other sources. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva says, well, we must be talking about Charish and Katzir about Shemitah, but Charish and Katzir Shemitah is also superfluous. So what must we be talking about? Charish shel erev shvi'it shu nichnas ba shvi'it, v'katzir shel shvi'it shu yotzei lemotza'ei shvi'it. Charish and Katzir represent two extensions of the Shemitah year. Charish extends the Shemitah year backwards in time, and Katsir extends the Shemitah year forward. Okay? How does it do so? Because Charish means preparing the land. So if I'm not supposed to plant the land, sow the land during the Shemitah year, so then that means I shouldn't plow the land in the 6th year. Because when I'm plowing the land in the 6th year, that's in preparation for the 7th year. So I've extended the Shemitah backwards in time. I'm beginning already during the 6th year to say, what's the point of plowing the land now during the summer of the 6th year when I'm not going to plant it next year? So there's no point. I'm not going to do that. Okay, so Charish extends the Shemitah year backwards in time. Katsir extends it forwards into the 8th year. How so? Katsir shel Shviit shu yotzei lemotzei Shviit. Let's say there is Shemitah year produce that I still have in my storehouses during the 8th year. Well, that produce will have the restrictions of Shemitah produce, such as the one we mentioned earlier, that when it's no longer available to the animal in the field, I can't keep it in my cupboard or in my storehouse. Okay, I have to remove it from my storehouse when the animal doesn't have it available. That's even during the 8th year. Okay, and so Charish and Katsir extend the Shemitah in two directions, backwards and forwards. Now, what has the Mishnah accomplished by doing this? Okay, they're like to leave you with two ideas about what the Mishnah is, why this is such a crucial idea for the Mishnah. Okay, the first idea is that Charish and Katsir really relate to the two main sections of Masechet Sheviit, which correspond to the two main sections of the discussion in the Torah. The discussion in the Torah divides into don't work the land, planting and pruning, and don't gather in the produce. Okay? So those are the two parts of the Torah's discussion. Masechet Sheviit divides into two similar sections, as we will see. The first section, basically the first 5 chapters, all talk about not working the land. And then the next 4 chapters will focus on what to do with the produce, how you go about consuming the produce. So the Mishnah is already signaling that here in Charish and Katsir. Charish is focusing on not working the land, and not working the land extends backwards into the 6th year. That's what's relevant to the first 2 chapters. What's not relevant to the first 2 chapters, but is already signaling what will happen in the 4 chapters that open the second half, is the Katsir part of it. Because the Katsir part of it will tell you what do I do with the produce, and that in turn extends on into the 8th year. Final idea for this evening, Tosefet Sheviit. Why is that notion so crucial? So where else do we encounter a notion of Tosefet?
Shabbos.
Shabbat, Yom Kippur, Chagim, other sanctified times. It's interesting to note, nowhere does the Torah tell us that the 7th year is sacred. The term Kodesh applies to the Yovel year, but it never applies to the Shemitah year. But there is a term that indicates that the year has sanctity, and that is Shabbat. Shabbat Lashem. A year that is devoted to God, so like other times that are devoted to God, okay, we have margins. Okay, you don't jump into sanctity. Sanctity is something that has to be approached. Okay, and generally speaking, there are twilight zones. Okay, now in Masechet Shabbat as well, you can find, okay, I was hoping we would get a chance to look at this more closely, but I'll just mention the first 6 chapters of Masechet Shabbat are mostly devoted to how you go about preparing for Shabbat, and how, as we get nearer and nearer to Shabbat, there are certain kinds of activities from which you should refrain because, okay, that will already get you dangerously close to doing work on Shabbat. So resting on Shabbat doesn't start on Shabbat. Resting on Shabbat starts on Erev Shabbat. And by the same token, for the land to rest, now that's the person. When the person rests on Shabbat, he has to begin preparing himself for that rest on Erev Shabbat. And what the first two chapters of Masechet Sheviit tell us about is that when we are preparing, okay, when we are approaching the Shemitah year, when the land is supposed to rest, so as we approach that year, we have to already begin letting the land rest. We have to take certain activities, okay, that are designed for the year, for the seventh year, in other words, to foster a growth of the land in the seventh year, and refrain from those already during the sixth year. And that starts preparing the land for its rest already during the sixth year. By the same token, we don't just jump from the sanctity of the Shemitah year into the eighth year, but we continue some of the Shemitah year into the eighth year. The produce of the Shemitah year continues to be treated in a special fashion even during the eighth year. Okay, we'll close with that for this evening. Thank you all. Okay, and okay, Bezrat Hashem, we'll see you next week.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Walfish, for this interesting first session. I'm looking forward to next week, and thank you everyone who joined us today here on Zoom, on Facebook, and on Drisha Live as well. We have another class going live again tomorrow evening, Tuesday at 8 p.m. It's a class on covenantal commandment, the sabbatical year in the Bible with Rabbi Silber. That's again tomorrow, Tuesday at 8 p.m. And in addition, you can always find information about what class offerings we have at any time on our website, www.drisha.org/classes. And you can watch classes live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Rabbi Walfish, and thanks again everyone who attended. We hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. And happy Chanukah, Chag Sameach.